This is a scene from the Iranian film Tall Shadows of the Wind, made only 1 year before the Iranian Revolution. The scene shows the people of a village revolting against the tyrannical scarecrows that have been ruling their lives and controlling their destinies. The scene, however, is not a typical one. In a country in which dictatorship is a political tradition, a provocative scene like this would not be tolerated by the censors. So it comes as no surprise that the next scene appears to serve as a disclaimer. We realize that what we saw was only a dream scene, the last dream of a dying man who made a one-man attempt to fight the despotic scarecrows and failed. The dream, however, is still alive. At his deathbed, the dying man, a driver, hands a piece of rock to the village teacher, something he has carried with him while battling the scarecrows. In a symbolic way, he is leaving the task of fighting to the school teacher. In spite of its being a dream, the uprising scene is a symbolically significant one since it accurately reflects the long-standing dream of a nation for a liberating revolution, a dream that has always been betrayed. There are more vivid, if less defiant, variations on the theme of betrayal of the dreams in other socially committed Iranian films. In Dead End, the protagonist is a young woman living in a cul-de-sac in the capital city of Tehran.
میرم تا زیر بازارچی.
تو این بارون؟
میرم تلفن کنم.
Her life begins to change one rainy morning when she finds out she is being watched and followed by a man. This is a traditional custom sometimes practiced by a man who's seriously considering a woman for marriage. For a typical Iranian girl in her situation, marriage could open a door out of a dead-end alley and out of many social dead ends.
Here she is, a young adolescent girl living alone with her mother. The brother is away, comes back sometime. She's of a marrying age, and she thinks she's found someone who's interested in her and that marriage will come.
یه مردی بود که گاهی وقتا سر کوچه کشیک میداد. مدتی پیداش نبود، اما باز دوباره پیدا شده. صبح که از خونه رفتم بیرون تعقیبم کرد. قبلا هم چند دفعه تعقیبم کرده بود.
فکر میکنی برای چی این کارو میکنه؟
نمیدونم، ازش خوشم نمیاد.
اگه بدونی به خاطر من این کارا رو میکنه، بازم ازش بدت میاد؟
به تو حرفی زده؟
امروز از اومده بود صحبت کنه.
صحبت کنه؟ با کی؟
نمیدونم. بهش گفتم شما نیستی. بهش گفتم من ترجیح میدم اگه حرفی داری با شما بزنیم.
خب چی گفت؟
هیچی نگفت، رفت. خیال میکنم بازم بیاد. بازم بیاد که با شما حرف بزنیم.
Why did you choose to have two empty seats at the dining table?
Well, those two seats belongs to two absent men. The father is died, and the brother is gone. We don't know where, but it presents that these two women need support.
سلام.
اجازه هست؟
خوب موقعی اومدی. هم مادرم هست هم برادرم. مامان با شما کار دارم.
سلام.
سلام. از این طرف خواهش میکنم.
چه خوبه با خانواده‌اش نیست. خیلی مضحک بود مراسم چای بردن و لبخند الکی به فک و فامیلش تحویل دادن. برادرتو برد. برادرتو برد. محمد.
متاسفم.
همه لرزش دست و دلم از آن بود که عشق پناهی گردد، پروازی نه گریزگاهی گردد. آی عشق، آی عشق، چهره آبیت پیدا نیست.
When it finally all unravels, it's terribly downbeat in American terms. He hasn't been her admirer. Yes, I suppose in a sense he has, but nevertheless he's been following her to capture her brother. And the film ends with him, the pursuer, taking the brother away and handcuffed, leaving the girl in tears, in desolation.
It's not until towards the end, I suppose partly the slightly menacing appearance of the Slovak agent, that you realize that actually, although she wasn't living in fear, because she was very naive, she should have been. And her greatest mistake was not to have been living in fear. And that's what ended up with her brother being taken away to torture and possibly death.
Parvez Syed, the director of Dead End, like many other Iranian filmmakers, has been living in exile since the 1979 revolution, a revolution that brought him his own bitter share of betrayed hopes and shattered dreams.
What do you think happens to the girl after the shattering experience she goes through in the film?
She gets a little bit experience.
She would receive a kind of, not a mortal blow, but a blow to her self-esteem and her confidence in herself, which it would take her many years to recover from, because she had the double horror of being partly responsible for her brother being taken away, and also of having somebody that she thought might be a fascinating husband about whom she built up this tremendous sort of imaginative investment, turn out not to be interested in her at all. And therefore, in personality terms, a terrible wound, a terrible double wound.
Dead End is a beautiful film. Beautiful in every sense that I can think of. Very subtle colors, almost into black and white, because I'm certain that Syed wanted that film to have a gloomy, repressive overall effect, and his use of a street out of which the young girl, the heroine, constantly looks, is at a dead end. And at that dead end, there's the message, flat out, dead end, no place to go from here, and beautifully done.
These films are making a very heavy allusion to the incredibly destructive effects of having such a system of surveillance widespread from the country, even stretching into tiny villages in the middle of nowhere.
The setting for Tall Shadows of the Wind seems to be one of those tiny villages in the middle of nowhere. In the beginning of the film, we see the inhabitants of the village in a mass ritual, praying that their God send them a liberator, someone to bring them prosperity and justice. Hoping for liberation, the villagers start erecting a scarecrow for their protection. But ironically, the scarecrow soon multiplies itself into a tyrannical army of scarecrows and begins to terrorize the villagers.
Yes, we make our own dictators because we can tear them apart if we like. And this is why the title Tall Shadows of the Wind really comes from a sentence that if you know the origin of the wind, you're never afraid of the tall shadows of the wind. And that's what we really are proposing in this particular film, that we make these deities ourselves and they start ruling our lives. And this is why in the film they make a scarecrow for very, very simple economical reasons, not religious reasons, because they want better crop and so on. And that scarecrow eventually starts ruling the village. Now, the fact that it actually happened because we made Khomeini, we made the Shah, and if we always have been having dictators all through our history, there is something inherently wrong with us as people. And this is why I was proposing that we should turn down, start all over again.
The all-pervasive sense of fear by a regime of systematic terror, to the point where, with the system of informers under which, with which every terror regime operates, nobody ends up by trusting anybody else. People become incredibly individualized, isolated. They won't talk to their neighbors or their friends or even their closest, their husbands or their mothers, about the experiences they've had.
We start at the beginning of the film with a lot of color in the clothing, in the decorations in the rooms and everything. You see very vibrant colors everywhere. And as the fear of the scarecrow gradually grows, we have faded out the colors. I mean, you potentially see the same dress worn by the same woman, but we had 3 shades of it. And in the last 45 minutes of the film, you're practically seeing black and white in color before the revolution sequence, and that's why it shocks. I mean, the red shocks so much, and then immediately after that we go more or less to total black and white in the funeral procession. And one of the objects was, as the fear grows, the color out of our lives goes out, and I just wanted to do this so gradually that it's not a shocking aspect, but eventually it's there.
I think, like in many nations, there are, of course, 2 levels of Iranian film. There's a popular level and a more artistic level. But one of the things that's most interesting about both levels is that on the popular level and on the artistic level, there's an extraordinarily moral quality to Iranian film. Even when we have films that are rather political in nature, the basic ideals and morality of Iranian life are being pointed up and being emphasized. There are a great number of themes which deal with the defeat or destruction of the main character. But I think if we examine the Iranian moral universe more carefully, we find that there are many, many examples where what seems to be defeat can actually be a victory as long as it's a moral victory. The main character achieves this moral victory by refusing to sell out or refusing to yield to a superior power which is corrupt and illegitimate. And this is a theme that we find again and again in many Iranian films. Even in a situation where the character seems to be utterly devastated, the real redemption, the real hero in the film may in fact, in this case, be the spectator, because the spectator becomes made aware of the disparity between a corrupt superior power and a person who's been victimized by that power. So the feeling of moral enhancement or moral enlightenment is achieved in this kind of plot construction.
Dr. William Beeman, a professor of anthropology at Brown University, specializes in cross-cultural communication. He spent more than 11 years in Iran prior to the 1979 revolution, studying the Iranian arts and culture.
One of the most important aspects of Iranian political film is that it's cast in an Iranian symbolic universe. That means that in order to be able to understand Iranian political film, We also have to understand Iranian literature and poetry, and to a certain extent, other artistic traditions like music and painting. I think that there's no form of artistic expression in Iran which is especially direct and easily accessible. All forms of artistic expression in Iran have many, many layers to them, and this is no less true about the cinema. So that the political cinema in Iran has a great deal of symbolism and symbolic layering in its construction. But this also gives it an artistic dimension, which can be appreciated over and above the political dimensions of the film. And this is one of the reasons why I feel it's one of the more interesting cinematic traditions in the world today.
The Cow is the film that started an Iranian film renaissance in the early 70s. It was smuggled out to the Venice Film Festival, where it won tremendous critical acclaim and, for the first time, placed Iran on the international film map. This highly original film depicts the hopeless extent of poverty in an Iranian village. The only cow in the village suddenly dies, and its death deeply affects the collective life of the village.
One day we were walking with Ghulam Hussein Saidi, the famous writer, and he suggested that I should read again the story of the cow in his book Azadarani Bayal, the Bayal's Mourners. Anyway, I read that and I found a lot of possibilities, potentials in the story, but of course the story was a short story, so we had to develop it. And that's where I started utilizing the other stories in that book and somehow coordinating them together and making a total story as we see it in the film. And then we worked together, you know, on the screenplay for, I remember, for 10 or 12 days. And then when the screenplay was ready, the problem was to find a producer. And of course, none of the existing producers would dare to invest in a film like that. So we submitted it to the Ministry of Culture as a kind of a documentary film. And they had a tradition of making, you know, documentaries and things like that. So hopefully we could arrange the budget and also utilizing all the actors of the Ministry of Culture who were already employed in the theater section.
But this doesn't diminish its power as a film about an individual who has everything that means anything to him in the world taken away from him in some mysterious fashion. His cow, the thing that provides him with all sustenance and every aspect of life, dies. And then the village society in which he lives conceals this from him, and he eventually is driven mad by his inability to find out what the truth is.
The cow dies. We don't know how or why, and I mean, this riddle remains all through the film. But the impact of this death upon the villagers, and particularly on Masht Hasan, is tremendous. So much so that Masht Hasan, out of his love or his attachment to this animal, he gradually undergoes a severe change in his psychological outlook. So much so that he somehow considers himself as a cow. He just identifies himself so much with this animal that he believes that he is the cow himself. This concept of the lover being dissolved or into the object of love, in other words, the synthesis of lover and the beloved, is one of the main concepts of, for instance, Ibn Arabi, when he talks about the metaphysical love, that in this quest that the mystic undergoes, he somehow, out of pure love or out of the richness of his love for the object, he becomes the other.
There's something so insane about this character and about his obsession. There's an Aristotelian problem with it. It becomes so pathological that you feel that this is an excessive example of it, and though it does indicate that the narrow margin, how close, you know, these people are to the breaking point.
Here's a man whose greatest possession in life is a cow. When the cow is gone, so to speak, his life is gone.
The film is actually is the love of a man for another being, which happens now to be a cow. And she's also pregnant and giving milk to the villagers, and the village is also very poor because they have only one cow. If you are familiar with Iranian Islamic philosophy of mysticism especially, some of their ideas are incorporated.
I showed the cow to my film class along with another Bolivian film, Blood of the Condor, because both of them, it seemed to me, were classics of the mid-60s, and therefore classics of the present wave of new filmmaking which is taking place in the Third World. Both of them give a very strong sense for immediate realities in an impoverished village in the Third World. I should say I also chose the cow because when I was giving that version of the film course, I began the course by trying to focus on images of the Third World in the United States. And at that stage particularly, the image of Iran was one of the clearest in people's minds, the whole barrage of hostile propaganda which circulated within this country. And therefore it struck me as being a good thing to say, well, okay, let's look at how Iranians define Iran rather than simply how the American networks do it. What the film did, or would do for any audience, which is alert to issues beyond their immediate backyard, is that it showed the humanity and sensitivity of the villagers in trying to deal with this case of psychiatric breakdown. And that was a very different image, which was important for me to show, a very different image of Iranians from the one presented on the network, which showed them as perpetual chanting fanatics. And I think it was an illumination to the students. I also had to point out that this was oil-rich Iran that was being portrayed. I think that anybody showing that film would probably have to emphasize that point and bring it out.
One reason that the film actually was censored, was confiscated for about a year and a half or 2 years, was particularly because of that. Because at that time, if you remember, it was the peak of Shah's modern civilization. He was talking about the threshold that now we are going now from the third world to the first world, or things like that. And right in the midst of all these talks, then comes this film, which shows, you know, a very poor village, and the people are not, you know, the desirable types that the government wanted to have. So that's how we came into a lot of conflict with censorship. But, I mean, the critics or the historians, they considered that this was the first time in the Iranian cinema that a film came out which could relate to both the public in general and also to the critics, to the art historians, to the cineasts, etc. This element of simple stories, documentary fashion, you know, human relationship, and particularly talking about the, you know, the underprivileged, the poor people, etc. This is one of the current issue that you see now in the Iranian cinema. And also it had a great success abroad, which was distributed in different countries and so forth. This had not happened yet in the Iranian cinema.
The cow, Gov, was a real landmark in Iranian cinema. It was the first cinematic representation of Iranian life, which showed in some ways the dark side of Iranian life, and yet was a fine artistic production. For Iranian filmmakers, a signal, I think, to them that films of serious content could be made that didn't necessarily follow the formulas of the popular cinema that had gone on before. It occupies a position in Iranian cinema which is similar to, you know, Pata Panchali in Indian cinema, which broke the mold of the Indian cinematic formula. Gov also broke the mold of the cinematic formula in Iran. It was telling people that a new form of artistic expression could be represented on film.
The Sealed Soil is one of the films that took advantage of the new artistic possibilities and experimented with a new visual language in Iranian cinema.
I'm trying to get out of Hollywood style. I think each filmmaker has to bring their own country's cultural background into their filmmaking. And since I studied painting and I'm very interested in miniature painting, I'm trying to use that format as my style, and I've combined that with the European aesthetics of Brecht. In Persian miniature, you have a whole story in a book told in one frame of the miniature, and you have the subject matters are all around the painting. It's up to the viewer to pick up the story and give it a meaning. The whole becomes one and one becomes whole. I've tried to do that with my composition. I feel that you don't have to have close-ups to accentuate in what you're trying to say. You could do it in by other means, like recurrent of motifs, or in other words, the action recurring again.
I think audiences would tend to find that a little too pace too deliberate, and the development of the character. Also, we're brought up by movie conventions. You know, you have a quick cut, and you get psychological development every shot. You know, and everything that way. And this doesn't operate on the psychological level at all. I can go with slow when it or apparently slow, because slow is misleading. There's no such thing as slow. What people mean slow, they mean there isn't a lot of plot, there isn't a lot of action, or the way you photograph somebody coming from somewhere. If you understand that that is ritual, and then there's no such thing as slow. If you understand the formal structure of something is painterly or ritualistic, then the slowness, you understand it. But if you don't understand what's going on, you just think this person just wants to waste time showing somebody walking. I mean, the idea that if you don't get the meaning that comes out of watching every step.
I'm trying to get into the idea of being distanced from the character, so that we are looking at them objectively, and we are trying to understand what the problem is.
A Sealed Soil is the story of a young village woman under pressure to conform to the rigid norms of a communal life.
این دختره چه شده؟ از مردم دوری میکنه. با کسی حرف نمیزنه. 18 سالشه. خیلی از وقت شوهر کردنش گذشته. شاید برای همین باشه. پس چرا جواب رد به همه داده؟ چشمش کردن.
She's being criticized because she is a different woman from what her older generation have been, and that's why she's being questioned and she's being criticized. But she, at the same time, she's not that different. She's in a state of moving from one awareness to another. She cannot follow her older generation's way of thinking and behavior. She's trying to find her grounds, and in that she's lost herself. She is lost, but at the same time she is trying to find some kind of an awareness, and I think that's what they're criticizing, and because they don't understand it. And also the fact that she's trying to be an individual. That is, I think, the most important thing in the film. The village life is such a communal life. I think what my protagonist is doing is trying to be an individual, and that's very hard for the villagers. Her past, her traditional life is and her what she has now is not giving her anything. So she hasn't come to consciousness yet, but she knows that she's missing something. And I think what is making her know that she's missing something is what is out there, the city life, the westernization of Iran that's creeping into the villages. She's been influenced by that indirectly, but she herself is not aware of it. All she knows is that things have changed and she's changing. And I think that's her dilemma. I don't believe in having the audience sympathize with the character, because that is going to create a false sympathy, and instead of the audience really trying to find out what is the problem and what is causing that, they start identifying with the character, and as the result they emotionally become so involved that they forget about being objective, and they become very subjective, and my whole criticism about Hollywood film is that it makes the audience so much involved emotionally with the character that they totally forget about the cause and effect.
نه چیزیش نیست ولش کن چیزیش نیست
باید مشرزه رو بیاریم که شیطون از تنش بیرون کنه باید اونو توی اتاق تنها بذاریم در روش ببندیم تا مشرزه برسه
نه من اونو با خودم میبرم
This woman, a girl completely breaking up, cracking, rejecting this world. That's the only way she can do it, is through madness, that she can rebel. And she does it. And I think you would be drawn to that. You would say, look, I'm here. I understand what's happening to you. I think this is a natural tendency. So I think there's a kind of logic to this construction, to the people who feel that the tragic vision, because they're the people who suddenly dimly perceive the nature of the betrayal, the nature of the repression, nature of the evil that's being practiced, the inequity, the injustice.
I was trying to show the repression of women in Iran, and but underneath that was another repression, which was the people's repression.
The trouble is that what happens is there's a conservative tendency in communities, and they have a different view. You know, in that community, let's say that story is absolutely true, with a woman who goes crazy, doesn't want to follow the traditional practice, doesn't want to be turned over like a piece of farm equipment. They'll say, oh, she's crazy, oh, she's, you know, which is reflected there. But most of the audience is looking at it says, oh, she's crazy, doesn't understand.
It's going to be taking a long time to have our society change, especially women's condition.
The movie is honest in this respect, and this is why it's not popular. I think the reason audiences would not go for it, even audiences, even people who feel, you know, women are, you know, not treated well, and they would want her to fight more, to come to understand what it is that's happening to her. But the artist here is too honest to let this person give you the big dramatic scene, the big Paul Newman scene. Ah, I understand, and this is how we do it. You know, this is what audiences want. They want the big hero or heroine to rise up and make a big speech or make a big gesture or something that the audience can identify with. Yes, I can control my destiny. The trouble, here's where the pessimism comes in. This woman cannot do that. She hasn't been educated, she hasn't been trained. It's impossible for her to find the words to express. She can only do it most inarticulate, primal way, deep inside her. And that's honest, but nobody wants to see that. In other words, it's saying you're trapped, there's nothing you can do. This is the only way you can express it through pathology. People don't want to hear that. But that's rather depressing.
A film that shows the misery of a family or a village is not necessarily a pessimistic film, but it is to make the audience to see why they are unhappy and try to do something about it. A village life is extremely vocal. It's extremely with a lot of expressions. I try to oppress all that because I was trying to bring in something which I'm trying to say, that oppression always brings in silence, and I was trying to show that through their silence and through their motionless, they were totally immobile, and for me that was what the oppression had done to them, and that was my way of political way of dealing with how an oppressive system can change someone's life.
I think the repression indicates that something has to happen within the people to change them, as in addition to before anything can happen outside. That is, if you want to repress your neighbor, or repress your daughter, or repress your son, or repress your people who are weaker than you are, then there's going to be somebody above you who's going to repress you. It's going to be a chain. You have to break the chain somewhere. And this is where, I differ with the Marxists, differ with the left. I believe the change has to come from within. I think the change people have to change right from within the circle. If we become more loving of our families, become more understanding of people around us, try to understand people around us, and work out, we may achieve some kind of change. But if we just make the change, all we do is what we've been doing for the past few thousand years, been substituting generally one tyranny for another. I mean, you can say this tyranny is better than that tyranny, but it's still tyranny. To break it completely, you have to genuinely believe in understanding the other person's existence, accepting another person's existence, the other person's point of view, the other person's right to express themselves and so on. And I think, if you follow a very tight, patriarchal, rigid, community life, that's going to reflect it ultimately at the top.
Andrew Saris could very well be talking about Arsalan Sassani's Bamboo Fence, which is, in spite of its surface value as a children's film, also a film about repression. The central character of this featurette is a small boy who separates a puppy from its mother and then, against his father's wish, desperately tries to keep the puppy.
I think the message in Bamboo Fence, hidden under everything, is that we Iranians are constantly confined. We confine ourselves. The bamboo fences that one sees so frequently. I don't think the message is saying that somebody else is confining us. I think it's saying that deep within us, we confine ourselves, and the father, who is so strong and appears to Western eyes to be so brutal to the child, slapping the child and taking the child's dog away. I know that a dog means something different in Iran from what it does in the United States, but to my eyes, he's a very brutal father. I think the message there, intended or not, says Iran wants strong leaders, in this case a father. Iran wants strong father figures, and Iran has always had strong father figures.
Dr. Louis Forsdale visited Iran twice in the 70s and was fascinated by the indigenous cinema he discovered there.
The quality of the films, their beauty, the photography was simply superb. Everything about them was something that was totally unexpected to me. A good example is The Bamboo Fence. A short film, the story of a young boy who's forever, within boundaries, within fences that he can't seem to break loose from, dominated by a father who appears to a Western eye to be extremely harsh. My heart goes out to the little kid.
The man is surrounded by his own problems. His problem is, it's much bigger that, for instance, the problem why the son doesn't go to school. No. You see the man, the time that he punishes the boy, you see the man, he spread the net, on the surface of the sea, but he doesn't get anything. He doesn't get anything. And he's so frustrated. And meanwhile, he's informed that his son didn't attend school. No, he's not mad because why his son didn't attend school. He's mad because he doesn't have anything to live with. The way of raising a child in a country like Iran, or better to say, a third world country, is absolutely different. That's because of poverty. It's because of the simplest thing that you should have in your life, but you don't have it. I remember my father used to hit me by hammer.
By what?
Hammer.
Hammer?
Yeah, hammer. Yeah. Or just, that was because my father has the same problem that this man has.
The Bamboo Fence, I think, is one of the loveliest short films I have ever seen, with the message so deeply embedded in the film that it doesn't slap you in the face, with a story that's so touching and so moving. I compare it with Lamourisse's Red Balloon, and that is very high tribute indeed, because among short films, I think of The Red Balloon being almost without flaw.
If Bamboo Fence represents the best of short Iranian films, Religions in Iran by Manucher Tayyip represents the best of Iranian documentaries. Religions in Iran compares and at times contrasts the religious rituals of 4 of the state-sanctioned religions in Iran under the Shah: Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and Zoroastrianism.
I think regardless to the title of the film, I had really no intention to make a film about religions in particular. I tried to make films about human beings and vis-a-vis their religions, something important to their lives, maybe through religions they try to get some answer to their questions. I really didn't want to make a documentary about different religious groups or sects. There were many other sects and religious groups that I never referred to them because, as I told, the main goal was human being and not the religion. That's why I never mentioned which religion is which. Such self-annihilation rituals exist in all religions. Sure, at this moment it seems a little bit violent, but it has nothing to do with a bunch of violent people that are praying. I never divided the religions. That's why I make cuts from one religion to other. And I wanted to make a unity in this film, because I believe if there is a God, is the one and only God, and there is no difference. And that's why I simply show people looking for something, trying to get closer to that, what they want. Sure, I wanted to show the violence, but not violence in a particular religion. It's the expression of human being. We can't control them. I mean, we can set a guideline how they have to pray.
What makes religions in Iran aesthetically distinct is a constantly moving camera that always seems to be trying to reach out for something. In effect, the camera itself turns into a pilgrim in a shrine.
My camera is a part of me, and if I see the scenes, I have to reflect my ideas through my camera.
Tayyip also carefully uses distancing techniques to keep his audience from being emotionally involved. He effectively intercuts long-moving shots of empty, sacred places with the same places packed with people in order to maintain an objective sense of separation of figure from ground.
I didn't want to get involved with emotionally involved with the whole action. I kept my camera sometimes in a distance. Sometimes I got closer, and sometimes I used a subjective camera, which means me and my camera was a part of this crowd. I used all these empty places to give my audience an opportunity to think and not getting emotionally involved all the time, because he had to make his own decision. You know, that's why I used these very slow camera movements in empty places like churches and mosques. That's the point. I really wanted to give him an opportunity to think.
The artistic flowering of Iranian cinema in the 70s was partly the result of a symbiotic type of relationship between the government and the quality filmmakers. The films, in their symbolic ways, were highly critical of the establishment, yet the filmmakers had to turn to the same establishment for financial support because their projects had little commercial appeal to attract any private investors. On the other hand, the government, while basically suspicious of the filmmakers and their intentions, found itself benefiting from being associated with them. The films were receiving tremendously favorable responses in international festivals, and the Shah's government was actively campaigning to counterbalance its debased political image abroad with as much cultural prestige as they could gain. The relationship, however, did not always work. Manucher Tayyip made his film for the Ministry of Art and Culture, one of the filmmaking branches of the government. But ironically, the ministry refused to issue a screening permit for the film.
As far as I know, this film has never been released for a public screening in Iran because of the controversy between the religious leaders at that time. They didn't actually like the way I made this film. Government people, I think they didn't have any specific idea, but they referred all the time. When they got such a film as a subject, they referred to the people that were in charge or were interested, you know, and then they made their decision. But I think, I mean, if they didn't release this film, which means to me that they really didn't want to show the film for public. And I asked them why they don't screen this film, I mean, publicly. They told me it's actually impossible to do it.
Religions in Iran was not an isolated case. A number of other government-funded or independent films were either banned or had problems receiving a screening permit.
One film in particular, which was kept out of circulation for a long time, and in fact never really achieved much circulation during the regime of the Shah, was the film Daire Mina. Now the story was that the Iranian Association of Physicians objected to this film because it was directly critical of the medical profession.
Well, yes, the reason that it was banned was because, I mean, it showed, you know, this kind of a poverty and everything. It was like the thing that, for instance, Dr. Erbal told me. He said that the way you showed this film was that we have a very beautiful restaurant, for instance, in appearance, very good, but you just don't show the restaurant. You go into the kitchen, and you show the dirty kitchen and all these, you know, cooks who are doing dirty works and so on. No, your film is like that. It does not show, you know, this modern, glamorous, you know, industrial country which they wished to show. So that's why they banned it, and it was banned again. The longest ban was on that film for 3.5 years. They paralyzed me because they wouldn't also allow me to make other films. All my projects would be refused.
حالش به هم خورد. چی شد؟ خوب شدی بابا باشه برو بیرون یا علی بابا جون
Very strong film. It hit me in the gut because I wasn't expecting it at all. I wasn't expecting the theme of the trafficking in blood, getting blood from diseased people and selling it to hospitals.
میپرسی چرا زرد میباشد رنگ تو حال من میدانی و خود را به نادانی زدی بشین بابا کتم داره بدش من خیلی خوب حالا بشین
چی هسته؟ این خون نداره بابا همین نیم ساعت پیش خون داده دیروز داده پیروز داده هر روز داره خون میده 6 جای دیگه میره خون میده
نداره بابا مشتری خودمونه
بذار بیاد جون هسته ول کن دیگه آخه خون نداره بابا چی شدی
all these laboratories in which these poor people, these addicted people would donate blood, they were all very secret and hidden from the public, and they would make a lot of money out of that. The things that I showed in the film was actually came from the reality, and even the locations that I used were the original locations.
The Psycho is very overt in its protest. It happens to protest blood exchanges which become contaminated and patients die and there are payoffs involved and that sort of thing. It's a very bitter, very direct film. It's directed at an entire system.
سلامش میبینم یلا بجا ببینم احتا نکن زود باش کتاتونو درارین آسیناتونم بزنین بالا دست رو درست بگی تا دست بگی بالا اینو بگی دستت بگیرم نمیتونی بگی دستت
حالا باز همین چه بگیری؟
آره عجله است واسه نخورتون ماشین جاتم راحت تری بذار اینم
باز این آقا سامری کارش گیر کرد بعد مدتی فرستاد دنبال ما
جوش نزن خونت کثیف میشه خیلی خوب اینم از این شیشه رو بیا جلو حسین را بیا
The point that is perhaps most politically important is that the film deals with the selling of blood, and this becomes an extremely important device for the film in order to make a political protest without making a political protest. We have individuals, downtrodden individuals, people from villages, drug addicts, and other individuals who are selling their blood in order to just simply survive. And we find a young and very innocent young man who is come to the city in order to try to get medical care for his father, and ends up being part of the ring, which rounds up individuals and brings them in order to sell their blood in order to feed a very lucrative medical practice.
بابات مرده کجا میری علی
even people who have the best intentions, like this young man, eventually get caught up in the entire process of corruption and of bleeding the public dry, literally, in order to be able to survive themselves.
You worked twice with Ghulam Hossein Saidi, the well-respected Iranian playwright. What attracted you to his work?
Well, first of all, I thought that he was the best dramatic writer, the best short story writer, the best, and his stories attracted me. They had somehow those elements which I always cherished in works of good literature. That is to say, different layers, different dimensions of meaning, of attitude, of human relationship, and particularly this mysterious symbolic, or one could say mystical element which exists in some of his works, that he somehow transcends, the given reality, and he somehow talks about certain elements which are surreal. And also the fact that he had a very critical, vivid critical vision in regard to the reality which existed around him, and he was tremendously involved, with the poor people, with all these conflicts, these issues, the political issues.
If there was one thing which perhaps stands out about those Iranian films that I've seen in terms of a common kind of subject matter and theme, it is, curiously, the apparent absence of the government, in a way.
It's probably a wish thing of a great many intellectuals that the government would disappear and that the people would emerge, would somehow follow their own instincts. There's a kind of low-key, anarchic spirit, I think, there. And I think they've moved into areas where they don't have to deal with the present. I think the absence of the government in films from a very repressive society indicate a desire, possibly, to escape from that.
And instead what you have are people who apparently are sort of living without any external authority in their lives, which I imagine is kind of omitted because it'd be almost impossible to treat, but who, on an individual basis, seem to be cutting each other up. Whereas a number of other cinemas that I've seen kind of focus on the struggles of women, or the clashes between the government and peasants, or whatever it is, somehow there's an individualization of conflict which is in the foreground of the Iranian films I've seen, and which I presume is left to be put in its context by the Iranian viewers who obviously live the context. Films which tried to give attention to general social realities could only do so without specifying what their causes were. So the causes have to be left to be filled in by the viewers. I'm reminded in a funny kind of way of some Eastern European films, some of the Czech films in the early 60s and so on, which again paid attention to a variety of things which were going on. And even to do that was highly unpopular with the Czech authorities, because they had a vision of Czechoslovakia as being, one of the best places in the world to live in, where problems were basically solved. If they weren't solved, would be solved next year. And there's a certain kind of reminiscence there for me.
My impression is that as long as criticism of the government remained on a symbolic level and not on a direct level, then a film would probably be allowed to be shown.
Not necessarily. Even when the films resorted to symbolic communication, they could still run into problems with the government. Witness Farmanara's Tall Shadows of the Wind.
The objection of the Shah's regime was that by a scarecrow, we meant Shah and his secret service. Another group of censors in the Khomeini regime, they said by the scarecrow, you mean Khomeini and his regime. I told them that this film was made prior to your regime, so we couldn't mean that.
In Iran, political relationships for centuries have had an extraordinarily unique quality. The ruling authorities have always tried to legitimize themselves by reference to some cultural or historical or moral system which is over and above everyday life. During the Shah's regime, the Shah tried to associate his regime with the pre-Islamic empires and with the institution of the monarchy down through history, and staged a number of symbolic celebrations in order to emphasize this. Under the regime of the Ayatollah Khomeini, we have reference to the legitimacy of Islam as a system. The interesting thing about pre-revolutionary and post-revolutionary Iran is that the hierarchical structure of the society has remained unchanged. It's difficult to criticize that authority without negating your acceptance of that basic relationship. And therefore, if you have grievances or you're unhappy about something or you want to express a protest, you have only two choices. One is to break the relationship and end up with something like a revolt or a revolution, or you can express your dissatisfaction in indirect ways. And the cinema turns out to be an important indirect way of expressing dissatisfaction with the current state of the moral universe in which individuals are involved.
They start with what they don't want you to have in your films. At the time of the Shah, you couldn't talk about the royal family, you couldn't talk about Islam, you couldn't talk about armed forces, and you couldn't talk about constitution. These were the four things that they said that you should not have in your films.
There were certain things which were taboo that you shouldn't touch, like for instance the critique of regime or the critique of Shah or critique of the ministers or the critique of whatever critique was completely taboo.
But once they were settled and became more powerful, they started telling you in the last couple of years what should be in your film. They said, we don't have a bad doctor, all doctors are good, so you should have a good doctor. And that's the end of creativity for anyone.
The ideal or the desire or the outlook of one or two or three particular person determines, you know, the destiny or the destiny of the film, you know.
I remember once with a friend of mine, we went to see the Prime Minister because we set up that new film group, an organization for young filmmakers. And we wanted to get some loan from government to make it, and we decided to make films independently without helping of the conventional market and commercial producers. And he directly told us that if you want money from us, you must make film for us, and the way we say it. But if you want make films for your ideas, you have to invest yourself, spend your father's money or your property.
They controlled everything. Even sometimes by investing money, they controlled filmmaking in Iran.
To an extent, they had become clever enough to use us as sort of safety valve. Let us do a political film and show it in Tehran and some festivals, and that was it. And the moment I realized that we were being used as a weapon to keep something safe for themselves, I stopped doing it that way, and I just started doing it, becoming more and more independent. But it was always antagonistic kind of relationship because they were censors, they were controlling all the valves, and I just, as an artist, I did not think that they should be doing that.
The relationship between Iranian filmmakers and the Iranian government was a highly ambiguous relationship. And I think what it really shows more than anything is that the Iranian government itself was not monolithic. On the one hand, we had certain areas of government that were not interested in having political expression be especially free or direct. Certainly were not interested in supporting anything which would turn back on government and promote criticism. And yet, on the other hand, we had other areas of government which were interested in fostering artistic expression.
Sure, they helped. I mean, if you are talking about restrictions, if you are talking about control, it doesn't mean that they had the whole nation in their hands. They had to. They had to do something for the country and for the culture of the country. And sometimes they use all these things as a propagandistic, to show themselves.
It is a matter of pride oftentimes for governments to support some kind of indigenous cinema.
Iran, I think, did that beautifully, at least the period that I know about, where much of the funding for films came from government sources. Interestingly, many of the films that were made under government funding had within them buried, covert, what I would read as subversive messages. But I guess the government censors weren't reading in the same way that I was reading, because they were being financed by the government and shown by the government.
Very often you have films that seem to be politically daring and courageous, and then when you analyze the situation, you find either they are what Carlos Fuentes said is a margin of dissent, you know, like 10%, like the government will tolerate this kind of, every regime, even the most repressive regimes will tolerate a certain amount of dissent, a certain amount of, in film anyway, a certain amount of criticism. Or else they're films made in exile, so to speak, or underground. Underground films are very hard to make. It's very hard to have the cinematic equivalent of Samit Sats. So I think political filmmaker, the filmmaker who wishes to say something political, although you can say, I would say that every film is political, no matter how vacuous or anything. If it says nothing, that is a political statement. That means that we're not going to say anything. So everything is political. I would say that the political filmmaker has to walk a tightrope, and I think we have to analyze the nature of that tightrope.
We come back to the question of censorship and the political regime, that only indirect statements can be made anyway, and therefore that, I suspect, tended to force an additional recourse to symbolic communication.
Under a totalitarian regime, usually, it happens because you haven't the opportunity to talk directly, and you try to find some way to express yourself. And this symbolism is actually the best way.
Somehow, in Iranian artistic tradition, things don't have much value aesthetically unless they're said in a highly indirect way. There's something about the artistic tradition in Iran which makes it necessary for the person who is approaching some artistic form to do some work himself in order to be able to discern the meaning.
What's interesting is the level of irony which a filmmaker can operate in, the level of allegory. One interesting thing is in Spain, the Spanish filmmakers during the Franco regime developed, including Buñuel, Viridiana, developed a very elaborate allegorical, symbolic subtext, I guess like science fiction writers did in America during the McCarthy era, that, you know, one thing represented another. And so you had this very elaborate subterfuge. And now some of that generation of filmmakers cannot compose in any other way.
The worst thing that could happen under such circumstances is the auto-censorship, which happens usually in countries, in societies ruled by totalitarian governments. It's must, I mean, the effect is much greater than to control, I mean, to have a system who controls.
In many cases, I don't think that was necessary to make such heavy films. I mean, by having such a heavy language. And the nature of making film, I guess, it's making film for people. If you make a distance between yourself and people, why should you make any film?
Most of the films I have seen from Iran, and I'm sure I haven't seen all of them. In foreign countries, we tend to see the film more of the intelligentsia, we tend to see, rather than the films that are more in the commercial mainstream. So we tend to get a somewhat distorted view of what a cinema is. But the films that are exported usually, particularly to festivals, to elite groups, to art house groups, to universities, to academic centers, tend to present a problem of the intellectual filmmaker trying to communicate with a larger audience from which he is somewhat alienated, somewhat separated.
The number of people who actually view these films was rather small. However, for these individuals, the fact that that political messages and messages of protest could be expressed even in a veiled way, even in an indirect way, was had a very powerful effect on those individuals.
What's interesting to me is obviously the gap between the people who are making the films and the society they're describing. It's an enormous gap. It's like centuries. And it's a strange situation.
If you're making a movie in a society, in a country, first you have to know your people, what kind of people, you know, are living in your country.
Here you have people who are, you know, flying in jets, making films about people who are going in ox carts. It's like centuries different. It's almost like archaeology, history. It's like going so far back, so far down, that the distance is just staggering. That's what I find interesting about them. How do you cope with that? And yet they're your people, they're your roots, your country, your blood. It's a hard question.
The Iranian Revolution in 1978 and 79 was largely engineered by people in the middle classes. And I have no doubt in my mind that the Iranian cinema in the 10 years previous to this contributed to the political awareness of people in the middle classes and educated classes, and particularly university students who formed an important aspect of political life in Iran in the late 70s.
The Iranian Revolution that replaced the monarchy of the Shah with the malacracy of Ayatollah Khomeini brought an end to a budding national cinema that had taken firm root despite the censorship and repression of the Shah's government. Although the revolution had initially brought them a promise of freedom, most Iranian filmmakers soon realized that they were clearly at odds with leaders of the new regime. Facing the dilemma of either submitting to the regime or maintaining their integrity, several talented Iranian filmmakers were forced to leave the country.
When the revolution happened, for a very short period of time, which is about 4 and 5 months immediately after the revolution, Iran was heaven on this earth because it was absolute freedom for an artist. I could do anything that I wanted. In fact, I had a script which was called The Day That the Shah Left. And all the preparation was there to start the shooting of the film. But all of a sudden, I saw that the signs of another dictatorship is starting. They started closing down the newspapers. They started having another group that going over this film scripts are now much more harder than it was before. And by some very strange, I mean, it was this very strange feeling that now that I had experienced that beautiful 5 months, the repression again was just so stifling as an artist that I just could not stand it.
Why did you leave the country?
Well, because I lost my job I couldn't make any film. I couldn't open my theater. So why should I be there? But anyway, if I would be there, I had to do something because people, I was working with them for a long time, they expected me to work. Even my silence would have some meaning, but the government wouldn't like it.
Me, I have never been directly in Iran. I have spent my time, most of my time in Europe. I went to Iran, made my film, and went to Europe.
I'm still in exile. I haven't seen any changes.
For an Asian artist, it's the very, very difficult thing to immigrate because you're transplanting yourself to a totally new society, and the chances of a 38-year-old tree to be transplanted to a new soil and not dying with our background and culture is very, very remote. So it's not an easy decision, but a decision that I had to make because I also have 3 children. And I didn't want them to be brought up under the same kind of repressive regime, and they didn't want to come to this world, and I owe them at least a better life. And this is why I left.
I wanted to go back. I have the intention to go back. But then I couldn't, you know, make myself to go back to a country that it's hard to live for people like us.
Arsalan Sassani's life in exile has not been easy either. He has been earning a living by driving a cab in New York City.
What I am doing here, maybe it's not only because of myself, you know, because I feel I have kind of responsibility to my child, that I still believe that he can have a better life here than if he go back in Iran.
Parviz Sayed's life in exile was not very different from Arsalan Sassani's in the beginning. For 3 years he worked as a receptionist at a Columbia University-owned building in Manhattan. Then he managed to obtain funds to make The Mission, the first Iranian film to be made outside of Iran after the revolution. The film turned out to be a critical success, and subsequently Sayed moved to Los Angeles, where he now directs stage plays for the Iranian community.
من به تو حق میدم. گوش بده. شما من حقت برو پی کارو میگم. آقا جان، من نزدیک اشیاء دارم به اخطار میخورم. من از شما معذرت میخوام. لازم نکنه شما از من معذرت بخواید. ما اصلا چه مناسبتی با هم داریم؟ ما دو قطب مخالفم. میفهمی مخالفم. من چه مخالفتی با تو دارم؟ مخالفتم باشم خب به عقیده تو احترام میذارم. اونم همینطوره. من نمیدونم امشب چش بود. هیچ وقت تابار اینطوری ندیده بودمش. من میدونم چش بود. من خوب میدونم اینجور آدما کجاشون میسوزه. آدمی که یه عمر راه خطا رفته مشکل به سرات مستقیم برگرده. همه این تیغ‌ها کونسوزی مال اینه که گفتن رقاصی موقوف، قرتی بازی، عرق خوری، سجود کثافتکاری دیگه موقوف. گفتن نوکر خارجی نباید بود. گفتن خیانت نباید کرد. خودت هم که الان بدتر از اون شدی. این حرفا چیه میزنی؟ این حرفا چیه میزنم؟ به ذائقه شما هم بد میاد. آقای سرهنگ فراری ساواک. ما مخلص شما هستیم. کجا؟ مگه به نگفتم جلو نیا. بایستا جاد.
How has been your life in exile?
Miserable.
Yes, sometimes it's painful, but when you realize the reality and the way that it is, so you just you give up.
Marva Nabili, whose film The Sealed Soil was never shown in Iran, made The Night Songs, her first feature film in this country.
You see, you're building up too late. This is too late. You're seeing someone dying. Your immediate reaction is to get people away from it. Action!
Action!
The film that was financed by PBS's American Playhouse is the story of a Vietnamese girl who experiences an identity crisis in New York's Chinatown.
Maybe eventually the exile thing disappears. The artist ceases to be in exile, becomes hyphenated, becomes part of it begins to operate away from a subculture, moves into the mainstream culture. I don't know. I don't know what I would say. I think he has to use his own instincts. It's very difficult to survive. He has my sympathy. I think, you know, for me, if I were to suddenly find myself in another country, forced to be in another country with a different language, with people who don't have my... I don't know how I'd function. I don't know what I would do. I mean, I think it's a nightmare situation.